Let me take you back in time to 1898. To the violent battles at Cuba, where American history changed forever. You'll be there in the jungles of Cuba when Theodore Roosevelt faces his first battle. You'll be there when the Americans desperately storm the Spanish fortifications at Kettle Hill and San Juan Heights. You'll be there when the Spanish fleet comes out to fight in the battle which turned America into a global power. Read Robert N. Maycomber's Honoring the Enemy, the story of how American sailors, Marines, and soldiers landed in eastern Cuba in 1898 and, against daunting odds, fought their way to victory. Epic events happened that summer, with Captain Peter Wake caught right in the middle. Spy story, love story, and war story. Honoring the Enemy is a page-turner about the 1898 battles at Cuba, which changed American and world history forever. Honoring the Enemy, the eagerly awaited 14th book in award-winning novelist Robert N. Maycomber's honor series of historical thrillers. Available from March 15th in your favorite bookstore or online.
Hello, I'm Terry Kolath. I'm here today with Robert Maycomber. You may know him from his novels. You may know him as a naval historian. You may know him as someone who teaches writing. You may know him in a lot of ways. And today, you're going to hear about his latest book and how he researched and wrote this book, Honoring the Enemy in Cuba. Thanks for joining me, Robert.
I'm delighted to be here.
We love having you come to Shell Point. We love how you take every challenge we give you. Will you teach writing? Will you tell us more about this country, or more about this time in history, or more about this person?
I have so many friends here.
You do.
And you know what? One of the great things, and one of the things that I love about coming here, is every single time I come here, I learn. Because so many people here have some life experience and expertise in areas that are so unique.
They are.
I love that.
Well, so are you. And as we talk about, through the years, about the fact that you are always writing a number of books at the same time, that you do your eyeball recon and go where these things happen to do your research, that you meet fascinating people.
I do.
And as a previous history teacher, you know the American history and you tie that in for us, and it's just priceless. Well, this covers a lot of territory. Cuba, Theodore Roosevelt, changes in American military. Where do you want to start?
Well, this book is, we'll talk about, maybe if we could, when and where it's set. So it's 1898. It's the Spanish-American War. You know, in Cuba they call it the Spanish-Cuban-American War.
Interesting.
Because they had already been fighting for years. And the Cuban army actually controlled a little over half the island and had bottled up the Spanish army in several areas. The Spanish outnumbered the Cubans. The Spanish outnumbered us when we got down there. And it was a very close run thing. Our army the whole army had 27,000 people in it.
The whole army?
The entire army of the United States had 27,500 people. Within 4 months, we had 274,000. They weren't ready. They weren't equipped. They weren't trained. They weren't well led. They had no real plans. It was all ad hoc. The Army was not ready for this war. The Navy was. The Navy had been gearing up. They saw it coming. The Navy was more involved overseas. We had overseas squadrons. Naval officers had served around the world. The Army hadn't served outside the country since 1846 in the Mexican-American War, 1848, excuse me. The Army wasn't ready, but the Navy was ready. They had seen this coming because they were more oriented towards the world and forward defense, and they were stationed around the world. The Army wasn't. The Army had not been stationed overseas since Mexico, which isn't that far overseas, in 1848. So, this book is set during that momentous summer. People tend to gloss over the Spanish-American War.
Yeah.
But, first off, it was not a cakewalk. It was very perilous. We lost thousands of men, and we almost lost most of the land battles. It was really nip and tuck. And when we invaded Cuba, it wasn't at the original invasion site that was planned. It was at a secondary site on the other end of Cuba, in eastern Cuba, in the jungles, in June and July. They were wearing wool uniforms in a tropical jungle. They landed 17,000 men and had only 5 ambulances. They just weren't prepared. And you're going to be there when you read the book. It starts in Florida, which was the staging area for it all. And Army headquarters was at this magnificent hotel in Tampa, which still exists.
That's great.
And so that starts at the Army headquarters. It ends up going into Cuba, and the reader will be ashore in the jungles with Peter Wake, and he will be with Theodore Roosevelt.
It's very exciting.
And Roosevelt was, of course, with a cavalry unit, which had mostly no horses. They were in a jungle. None of them had ever, including him, had ever been in a jungle before. They had to learn as they went. There were mistakes made. Men died because of those mistakes. And so this book is, you're going to be there. You're going to feel these emotions. It's also a love story. Wake's wife is Spanish-born. Some people consider her to be an American, or she is an American. Some consider her to be an enemy. And she signs up with Clara Barton to be a volunteer nurse. Now get this, Clara Barton was 77 years old when she went into the war zone in Cuba as a volunteer nurse.
77.
She had already been at 4 wars in her lifetime.
So we'll even learn
As
more
a
about her.
combat nurse, yes. I have huge respect for Clara Barton.
I guess.
So Wake's wife is going to be in Cuba too, with the volunteer Red Cross at the Army hospitals. It's a tremendous love story. It's what it's like to be a man we're raised to protect, and yet your wife is in the combat zone. What do you do? How do you handle that? It's a spy story. There was a lot of intrigue leading up to this, and there was a lot of intrigue in Cuba and a lot in Florida. And of course, it's a war story. In the first week of July, 1898, there were 2 momentous battles, one on land, one at sea. We came real close to losing the land battle. We won overwhelmingly the sea battle. And throughout it all, the Americans learned that the Spanish enemy was not a pushover. They weren't going to cut and run. They were well armed, they were well led, they were well supplied, they were veterans. They never cut and ran. And that's why the title of this book is Honoring the Enemy.
That is fabulous. Now, you can't tell us anymore.
Okay.
People have to sign up. You have to come to the class. The interesting thing, besides everything you've heard, is that Robert Macomber researches right there, both in Tampa and the eastern end of Cuba.
Yes.
So you will hear more about all of this. You'll hear more about Theodore Roosevelt. You'll hear more about how these events changed the course of history. But you have to sign up and join us.
Please do.
Awesome.
That was really good. This is